Deaf boy opens the door of his house to a pit bull. And what this dog does with the child is unbelievable and will break your heart. Imagine entering a room full of children laughing, talking, sharing secrets. But you don't hear anything about that. Everything you see are mouths moving, laughter that seems to occur in a distant, inaccessible world. Now imagine that you are Pedro, a 10-year-old boy who was born without being able to hear. Every day he walks through the corridors of the school feeling that he is trapped behind a glass. He sees everything, but he cannot participate. Pedro tries to fit in, but things never go well. During recess, he sees his classmates in groups, telling stories he will never understand. When he tries to get closer, he ignores him. Even worse, they start laughing in a way that makes it clear that he is the reason for the mockery. He does not understand the exact words, but the way they look at him says it all. In the end, Pedro wants to be like the other children. He would like to run, play, laugh without worrying about who is watching him. But instead of that, it's like having an invisible sign hanging that says, "Too different to be accepted." When the bell rings, Pedro sighs relieved. At least in the classroom he can hide behind the notebooks. But even there he perceives the glances, the hidden laughter. All of this makes his chest feel compressed in a way that he can't explain. It's a mixture of shame, sadness, and that question that never leaves his mind. Because I had to be like this. And so he returns home every day. His steps heavy, his backpack seems to weigh a ton. There, he closes the door of his room and lets the tears fall in silence. It's not fair, he thinks. I just want to have someone who understands him, someone who doesn't need words to be his friend. Pedro didn't know, but life was about to bring him something that would change everything. And this time, he wouldn't be alone. It was another day for Pedro. He returned from school with the same weight on his chest. The backpack seemed heavier, but not because of the books. It was sadness, the feeling of not belonging anywhere. His slow steps showed that he was in no hurry to get home, where silence was waiting for him, as always. When Pedro walked near the market, something caught his attention. A dog. He was skinny, dirty, with fur floundering around for a while without bathing. He was there, near the fruit boxes. His eyes were big, almost human, as if they were asking for something. Pedro stopped for a moment. It was as if the world had been silent, a silence that he knew very well. The dog looked at Pedro and moved his tail slightly, but did not approach. He seemed as lost as the child. Pedro watched him, feeling something strange inside him. It was as if that dog understood what he felt. It was like looking at a reflection, two invisible beings, ignored by those who passed by. Pedro opened his backpack and took out the lunch that his mother had prepared. He split the sandwich in half, looking at the dog as if he were offering a piece of his own life. Slowly, he crouched and left the bread on the floor. The dog waited for a moment, but soon approached. He ate fast, as if he hadn't seen food in days. Meanwhile, Pedro remained there. He was quiet, but with a heart beating faster. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. When the dog finished eating, he stared at Pedro, as if he were thanking him with his eyes. Pedro smiled, a small smile, almost shy. He got up and started walking home. But, to his surprise, the dog started following him. Step by step, he was following him with that loyalty that only animals have. The dog was sitting, moving its tail, as if it was waiting for an invitation. Pedro crouched and made a signal with his hands, the only way he could communicate. The dog bowed its head, as if it were trying to understand. And there, in that simple moment, a connection was born that words could never explain. Pedro decided to call Bob. He wanted to take care of him. He wanted Bob to be the friend he always dreamed of. But, deep down, Pedro knew that convincing his mother would be another challenge. Even so, at that moment, he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Pedro didn't imagine at that moment that a tragedy was about to happen in his life, and Bob would play a decisive role. But before continuing, subscribe to the channel and tell me since what city you are seeing us. When Pedro entered the house, the joy of having found Bob was still reflected on his face. He didn't waste time, he went straight to the kitchen, where his mother prepared dinner. With quick and anxious gestures, he tried to explain, "Mom, there's a dog outside. He needs help. Can I stay?" Pedro's mother stopped what he was doing. The tone of urgency on his son's face was impossible to ignore. He dried his hands with the kitchen cloth and looked out the window. There was Bob, sitting in the patio, moving his tail as if he were already part of the family. But before Pedro could finish gesticulating, his mother denied with her head. "No, Pedro. That dog is from the street. It could be dangerous." Pedro felt his heart tighten. He gesticulated again, trying to argue. "But it's good. He needs me." His mother sighed deeply. "Pedro, I know you want to help, but we can't take risks. He can't stay here." The words of his mother fell on Pedro like a bucket of cold water. He looked at her, waiting for her to change his mind. But the only thing he got was that firm look of, "Don't insist." He left the kitchen slowly, without the strength to continue arguing. In the courtyard, Bob was still there, as if he knew that Pedro was his only chance. Pedro crouched next to him, passing his hand through his dirty coat. He looked into the eyes of the dog and felt a pain that seemed to reflect his own. "I'm going to help you," he thought, although he didn't know how to do it. That night, while his mother thought that he was in his room, Pedro returned to the patio with a piece of hidden bread. Bob moved his tail slowly, grateful. Pedro felt a mixture of sadness and joy. He knew he couldn't take Bob inside the house, but that didn't mean he would abandon him. From that moment on, Pedro began to take care of Bob in secret. He kept a piece of his lunch for the dog every day. Bob patiently waited for him in the same place, as if he knew that Pedro would always return. And with every encounter, the bond between them became stronger. Pedro knew he was disobeying his mother, but deep down he felt he was doing the right thing. Because in Bob's eyes, he found something no one else could give him: friendship without judgment. Pedro began to feel something different, something he had never felt before. It was as if, when he looked at Bob, his heart would fill with warmth. You know? Like when you have a hot chocolate on a cold day or you receive a hug after a difficult day. I had never had such a friendship. So sincere, so pure. With Bob, there were no expectations, judgments, or difficult words to understand. Just a look, a gesture, and everything made sense. The dog did not pay attention to the things that made Pedro feel insecure, like his deafness or the laughter of his companions. For Bob, Pedro was enough as he was. For the first time, Pedro felt that was enough. It was something so simple but so powerful. Bob moved his tail and looked at him with those bright eyes, as if he were saying, "I'm here for you." And that was all that Pedro needed to hear, even if there were no words. With Bob, he didn't feel strange or different. He felt accepted. In those moments, sitting next to Bob in the patio, Pedro understood that true friendship doesn't need anything more than presence. He didn't need conversation, explanations, or effort. Only someone willing to be there. And Bob was there. Despite his mother's prohibition, Pedro and Bob continued to watch each other in the backyard every day. Bob seemed to understand Pedro in a way that no one else could. When Pedro made signs with his hands, the dog bowed its head, as if it was really paying attention. They didn't need words or sound. It was as if Bob knew exactly what Pedro wanted to say. Pedro felt that Bob filled a void inside him, a space that he didn't even know existed. When he was with the dog, he didn't feel excluded or strange. It was just Pedro, and that was enough. And Bob? Bob seemed happy just to be by his side. Both of them had a simple but special routine. After school, Pedro always appeared with some hidden food. Bob was already waiting, moving his tail as soon as he saw the boy. Pedro sat on the floor of the patio, while Bob lay down by his side as if saying, "I'm here for you." With time, Pedro began to teach some commands to Bob using his sign language. He made simple gestures, like asking Bob to sit down or stay. And the dog obeyed with impressive intelligence. Each small success made Pedro feel a huge pride, as if he had found someone who really understood him. The days became less heavy. Now he had a reason to speed up the process. He knew that Bob would be waiting for him in the yard, with that loyalty and affection. But Bob wasn't just a friend, he was a refuge. When Pedro was sad or frustrated, he sat next to Bob and started to talk with his hands, taking off all the things that happened in school. Bob remained still, just looking at him as if he said, "I understand you." In some way, Pedro really believed that he understood. Pedro had never imagined that a dog could change his life so much. But Bob was there, showing that the best connections do not depend on words, sound, or explanations. They only depend on being present. In that courtyard, both were more than friends. They were a team. It was any afternoon at Pedro's house. The sun shone brightly, illuminating every corner of the courtyard. Pedro's mother was in the garden, watering her plants carefully, as he did every day. It seemed calm, different from what was about to happen. Pedro was in his room, absorbed in his drawings. His fast hands shaped a new creation on paper, while Bob rested near the door, with his snout resting on his legs and eyes closed. Everything was calm, until Bob suddenly raised his head. His eyes opened suddenly and his ears leaned forward, as if he had perceived something. Pedro noticed the change in the dog's behavior. Bob never got so tense for no reason. Pedro stopped drawing and watched his friend with attention. He didn't hear anything, but Bob's attitude said a lot. Something wasn't right. Bob started to grumble softly, looking at the door. Pedro frowned, feeling his heart racing. He tried to calm the dog down with signs, but Bob didn't look away from the entrance of the room. A cold step ran over Pedro's back. He slowly got up and looked through the door. In the room, two men had just entered through the main door. They were armed with harsh and threatening expressions. Pedro could not hear what they were saying, but due to his body language and aggressive gestures, it was clear that they were not there with good intentions. His mother, visibly scared, was standing in the center of the room. He raised his hands slowly, trying to calm the situation, but his face reflected despair. Pedro felt as if his heart stopped. He didn't know what to do. He returned to his room and slowly closed the door so as not to make noise. He ran to hide under the bed, taking Bob with him, trying to keep him in silence. But Bob was restless, sniffing the air, as if he understood the danger lurking in the house. Meanwhile, in the room, the tension was increasing. One of the men began to stir drawers, throwing objects to the floor in search of something of value. The other one was standing near Pedro's mother, screaming and gesticulating. She tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking as she handed her bag over and pointed to a closet where she kept some savings. Under the bed, Pedro couldn't see what was happening, but every second seemed like an eternity. Sweat was running through his face and holding Bob tightly, trying to prevent him from making noise. But Bob was increasingly restless, as if he were ready to attack. Pedro knew that if Bob left there, it could be dangerous, but he didn't know how to stop him. In the room, the situation came out of control. One of the men pushed Pedro's mother, making her fall to the ground. He started screaming something, pointing at her with the gun, demanding more. Pedro saw through the door's door the moment his mother fell. He felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of fear and impotence. He wanted to run towards her, protect her. But he knew that would only make things worse. Bob couldn't wait any longer. He was restless from the moment he felt the danger. But now, seeing Pedro's mother being pushed and falling to the ground, something inside him exploded like a silent scream of, "Enough." His eyes fixed on the door in the room, and his tense body was like a spring about to come loose. Pedro tried to hold him, but there was no force that could contain the instinct of protection that was beating inside that dog. In a quick and determined jump, Bob escaped from Pedro's hands. The boy tried to grab him again, but Bob was already ahead, running like an arrow towards the room. The sound of his feet hitting the floor was resonating throughout the house, but what caught everyone's attention was the grunt. It wasn't just any grunt. It was serious, ferocious, as if it was loaded with all the emotions that Pedro couldn't express. The thieves who were focused on Pedro's mother. They turned immediately when they heard the threatening sound. Their eyes opened wide to see the dog that was coming towards them, showing their teeth, ready to attack. At that moment, Bob seemed bigger, a force of nature that no one could ignore. Before they could react, Bob jumped directly on the leg of one of the men. His teeth clung tightly, and the thief made such a loud scream that the walls seemed to shake. He tried to get rid of the dog, shaking his leg, but Bob didn't let go. The grunt continued, more intense, as if he wanted to make it clear. "You're not going to hurt anyone else here." The other thief tried to intervene, giving quick steps towards Bob, but the dog was agile. Before the man could reach him, Bob released the leg of the first thief and turned with agility, now heading towards the second. He advanced with so much determination that the man tripped backwards. He could barely raise his hand to protect himself while Bob grinned, with his teeth shining with fury and courage. Pedro's mother, still on the ground, watched the scene with a mixture of shock and relief. Bob was not just a stray dog. He was a protector, a guardian willing to risk everything for that family. And at that moment, nobody could doubt it. The thieves, completely surprised by Bob's ferocity, did not know what to do. The first one kept trying to crawl away. He was limping in pain while holding his leg. The second, in panic, grabbed what he could and began to retreat towards the door, stumbling with the furniture. However, Bob did not retreat. He remained among the thieves and Pedro's mother, grunting with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavier. Pedro left the room carefully, his heart still accelerated. He saw the scene in front of him, his mother on the floor, holding the weapon that one of the thieves had dropped. And Bob, his loyal friend, defending his family as a true hero. Pedro wanted to run to his mother, but his body was shaking so much that he could barely move. When they finally arrived at the door, the thieves let the stolen objects fall in their hurry to flee. As soon as they left, Bob ran to the street, digging and chasing them a few meters, making sure they would not return. Only then did he return, wandering, but with the same determined expression. Pedro's mother looked at Bob as if she saw him for the first time. He was still on the ground, trying to process everything that had just happened. When Bob approached her, moving his tail shyly, as if he wanted to make sure he was okay, he finally understood. That dog, who he feared and rejected so much, had risked his life to protect them. Pedro ran to his mother, throwing himself into her arms with force. He cried in silence, feeling the relief and gratitude that they were safe. Bob sat beside her, watching the scene as if she were saying, "I just did what I had to do." After a few minutes, Pedro's mother got up, still hugging her son. She looked at Bob with her eyes full of tears and passed her hand through her coat for the first time. She was wrong, she said, more to herself than to Pedro. This dog didn't save him. Pedro smiled, hugging Bob with strength. He knew from the beginning that Bob was special. But now, his mother also knew. That night, Pedro's mother made a decision. While she was cleaning up the mess the thieves had left, she looked at her son and said, "Pedro, I think Bob deserves to stay with us." Pedro's face lit up. She hugged her mother tightly and then ran to the patio where Bob was resting. She made quick and emotional signs, thanking her friend. Bob, although exhausted, moved his tail and supported his head in Pedro's lap, as if he knew that, finally, he had found a home. Since that day, Bob was not only a stray dog. He was part of the family. And more than that, he was the friend that Pedro had always dreamed of having. The thieves did not get very far. Hurt and disoriented, they strolled down the street while Bob was still barking, his sound resonating through the neighborhood like an alarm. Neighbor after neighbor left his house, and the police, called immediately. With the precise descriptions of the thieves and the marks of the bites on the leg of one of them, they had no escape. The two were arrested right there, a few meters from Pedro's house. When the police returned to thank the family, one of them looked at Bobby and said, "This dog deserves a medal." Pedro, without hearing the words, saw the smile on his mother's face and the satisfied look of the police. He understood enough. Bo was a hero. Later, after the confusion was gone and silence filled the house again, Pedro was sitting on the sofa next to his mother. Bob rested next to the boy, exhausted, but with an attentive gaze, as if he were ready to protect the family again if necessary. Pedro's mother looked at him, her eyes loaded with something the boy did not see often, concern. She gently touched his shoulder to draw his attention. When he turned his face towards her, he began to communicate, using the signs that he understood so well, but that she, until that moment, rarely used in such an expressive way. "Pedro, I need to ask you something," he began, his hesitant but firm gestures. "Do you feel alone in school?" Pedro looked down, playing with his fingers while processing the question. He made a small sign with his hand, a yes that seemed to weigh more than any word. The mother felt her chest tighten. He had always known that school was a difficult place for him, but he had never imagined the depth of that loneliness until that moment. He realized that, while he was busy protecting Pedro from physical dangers, like the thieves of that night, he had ignored the internal battle he faced daily. "I know that sometimes you may think that I don't understand how you feel," he continued, now with clearer signs and a look full of tenderness. "But I see you, Pedro. I see how strong you are, how you try. Every day, even when things are difficult." Pedro looked up, surprised. He didn't expect that. It was the first time his mother spoke so directly about how she felt. "I've decided something," he said, taking a break to make sure he was following her. "I'm going to change schools. It will be a special school where you will meet other children who also use signs, who may be your true friends." Pedro's eyes opened in peace. He made a quick sign like someone asking, "Really?" "Really," she replied with a small smile, but sincere. "Will it be more expensive?" "Yes, but that doesn't matter. You matter, and I will do whatever is necessary to make you happy." Pedro didn't know how to react. He felt that his eyes were filled with tears, and without thinking too much, he hugged his mother with force. She responded to the gesture, holding him as if that hug was the answer to everything. He was there. He raised his head as if he knew something important was happening, and he supported his snout in Pedro's lap. The boy smiled, caressing the dog's head. At that moment, with the promise of a better future and the presence of his mother and Bob, Pedro felt something he had not felt for a long time. He was not alone. And that changed everything. Pedro's life completely changed after that night, with the decision of his mother to enroll him in a new school. You felt that? For the first time, someone really believed in his potential, in his right to be happy. But the transformation was not only for Pedro. Bob, the hero of that night, also gained a final place in the family. He was no longer just the stray dog that Pedro had found. Now he was an indispensable loved member. When the classes began at the new school, Pedro was nervous. His heart was beating fast as he entered the classroom for the first time. But to his surprise, he didn't find any malicious glances or bad intentions. Instead, he saw other children who, like him, communicated with their hands and heart. For the first time, Pedro felt like he was part of something bigger. He made friends who understood his challenges, who knew what it was like to be different. He didn't have to explain his order or feel excluded anymore. In that environment, Pedro was simply Pedro. Bob also became a beloved figure in school. Pedro always talked about him with his new friends, describing how the dog had saved his family and proudly showing the signs that Bob had learned to understand. On a special visit to school, Bob was received as a true hero, with all the children queuing to caress him. The dog, who used to wander aimlessly in the streets, was now surrounded by love and recognition. At home, things also changed, but he seemed more confident, happier. He began to communicate more with his mother, using signs and expressions that were previously limited by the invisible barrier of loneliness. Pedro's mother, on the other hand, dedicated herself to learning more about how to communicate with him, participating in sign language courses. This new dynamic brought a closeness that they had never experienced before. And Bo was always close, like a faithful guardian. He accompanied Pedro to the school door and anxiously waited for his return. When Pedro arrived, Bob moved his tail with an energy that seemed to say, "I knew you would come back." The afternoons filled with games in the yard, where Pedro laughed more than ever. Although he did not hear the sounds, he felt the joy of vibrating around him. Over time, the story of Pedro and Bob began to inspire other people. The neighbors, who had barely noticed Pedro, began to admire him. The boy who had faced so much prejudice was now an example of overcoming. The mother of Pedro received questions from other families about how they had managed to overcome so many difficulties. And Pedro, with his simplicity, always made sure to say, with signs and a smile, it was love that changed everything. This experience left a deep lesson for everyone. Pedro learned that true friendship and love can come from wherever it is least expected, even from a stray dog. His mother understood that, sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is to believe in their potential, even when the world doesn't. Ivo showed that courage and loyalty don't depend on words, but actions. Together, Pedro, his mother, and Ivo formed a new family, more united and happy. While they were looking to the future, They knew that this could bring anything, because now they had something they would never lose. Love, confidence, and the certainty that, together, they could face any challenge. Thanks for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your opinion about this story.